This is a dual Sega Genesis and Dreamcast console arcade. It runs stock, unmodified consoles with a CRT television, illuminated marquee, and a control panel with an analog joystick support. The arcade body is custom designed and built to simply be a showcase for these consoles because I just love them. But the real noteworthy feature of this arcade is the ease to switch between consoles. Pressing the AV switch to switch audio and video signals, and then press these buttons on what are network switches, which routes the respective controller inputs to the control panel. Nothing to unplug, remove, or disconnect. You can switch between playing either console in a few seconds. I'm going to spend the rest of this video explaining in detail how I did this 2-in-1 arcade control panel, plus some of the other basic features of the arcade. The scope of the wiring is kinda simple. We have 2 game consoles and 1 control panel. So instead of switching the control panel to play a different console, we'll just switch the inputs between the controllers. The compromise here is we don't have to build 2 custom control panels, which saves a lot in cost and arcade parts, but we do have to spend some time and effort routing and landing wires. Since I have to route a bunch of signals or wires, it might be better to use cables that already exist, leveraging on something common and not custom in this case. Pre-made DB9 and DB15 cables are an option, but they're not as economical as Ethernet Cat5 patch cables. Patch cables are the way to go in this case. Doing some foreshadowing here, utilizing the RJ45 connector would also be beneficial too. It's reliable and robust, which I'm going to need to connect stuff downstream in this setup anyway. I made this breakout connector for this case. So let's look at the control panel. We can land all the arcade button inputs on the control panel to a pair of RJ45 plugs. And from here, we need to split into 2 routing paths and ideally switch between them. This translates to a 2-to-1 multiplexer, or in this simpler build, a 2-to-1 switch. The switch should isolate between the 2 channels or consoles in this case. And this all seems like a custom part, but it turns out for like $7 shipped, you can get a 2-to-1 network switch that physically switches and disconnects or isolates all 8 conductors, which is very convenient. Pressing the A or B buttons on these switches will switch all 8 conductors of the Cat5 patch cable. This switch is bidirectional, so we can use it as a 2-input to 1-output switch. So hold this thought. We have to look at the opposite side of this diagram from the console side to add some context of how this all goes together. The Dreamcast and Genesis are connected to their respective controllers. The Genesis controller is a reproduction controller breakout I made. Electrically, it's identical to any Genesis controller, but it has some features for arcade implementation. It's a 3-button controller with screw terminals for wiring to arcade control panels. I've landed all the button inputs to a pair of Cat5 cables with male RJ45 connectors left on the end. I just cut a cable in half and wired one side to the controller. I had planned to do something similar with the Dreamcast controller, but it's a bit more complicated to reverse engineer and not worth the time for a one-off thing. There are arcade encoders by Brooks with built-in memory card storage, but it's costly compared to the value of just having a non-OEM controller. So I just did a pad hack of a Mad Catz controller, which means I just solder every single button input to the respective controller button pad locations. To my surprise, the Mad Catz controller had test pads for every input, so this turned out to be a lot easier than expected. Another feature of the controller is we can plug a VMU into the controller circuit board, so the Dreamcast has the ability to save and load game data. I did have to snip off the second controller peripheral slot to save space, but there's no use for a rumble pack in this scenario. And another benefit to the Mad Catz controller is it's kind of a 6-button pad, but really it's just the L and R triggers in disguise posing as the Z and C buttons. To condense space, I did have to remove the potentiometers that are soldered to the triggers. Be careful doing this because it will make the trigger inputs floating, so you'll get some weird behavior. I did have to solder a resistor to pull down the inputs on these traces. And just like the Genesis controller, these button inputs are wired to another pair of Cat5 cables, which means we've covered all the shared control panel inputs on a second pair of Cat5 cables. And I'm going to use this 2-to-1 network switch to switch between these pairs like this. In my setup, pressing the A toggle on the network switch will enable the Dreamcast controller inputs. Pressing B on each switch will enable the Genesis inputs. The VMU is still hardwired on the controller's PCB, so there's no disruption there. We're only switching the inputs from the control panel to the controller's face buttons. To switch between the consoles, you press the AV switch plus these two network switches. So this makes swapping between consoles fast, and we avoid having to build or swap between two custom control panels. The compromise is there's a lot of effort in wiring, but this solution is much more economical. And finally, to round out this featured-filled arcade control panel, we have the analog nub. This analog thumbstick is a common Arduino prototyping part. The breadboard part is cheaper than the actually buying the raw analog assembly, so that's why I went with it. I made this 3D printed support to make it easy to mount into a control panel, and it's just connected directly to the Dreamcast. There's no need to route it through the switch because the Sega Genesis doesn't have this to swap between. And the reason for it is honestly there's too many Dreamcast games that utilize analog controls to just opt out of an analog input. So with this, we have the full support of the Dreamcast library with the tiny limitation of no analog triggers, which I think is totally fine. The rest of the cabinet is rather simple. AC power comes in from the back, and this is just landed to an outlet. Then a power strip because that wasn't enough plugs. I've got a various amount of plugs and power adapters hidden under the bottom shelf, which is a mess, so it's hidden and we're not going to talk about it anymore. Cable routing was still a chore, and sadly I have all the cables kind of bundled together in this crosstalk mess, but I'll just leave it there. To illuminate the console shelves, I just use these automotive reverse lights. They are cheap, low profile, emit white light, and are dimmable with the help of this motor PWM board. I made a 3D printed bracket to mount a light in the corner of each shelf. Having the entire interior painted pure white helps white light reflect everywhere and give off that glow. I made the marquee by redrawing the Dreamcast logo and typeface with some edits, laser cutting this, and then painting it black. It was going to be white at first to match the base colors of the cabinet and the color scheme of the Dreamcast, but black had just much better contrast, so I went with that. I also made this PCB to drive some addressable LEDs, which illuminate the marquee. These potentiometers help me dial in the color while reading the red, green, and blue values, which are then hard-coded in the program. This Super Nintendo example is a better illustration example of why having the potentiometers and a live adjustment of RGB values is useful. Any section of the marquee that idles as like a separate color needs a barrier so there's no light bleed between two different colors. And there's a barrier between the Dreamcast logo and the text similar to the SNES logo example here. The TV in this arcade was just a Craigslist special. It only has AV ports in the front, which kind of are in the way of the front bezel. I opened up the TV, soldered some leads to the ports on the front of the PCB, and just routed this to new ports in the rear, drilled holes, and mounted new plugs. And while I had everything apart, I did wash the inside of the housing. It was stinky. The speakers and amplifier are both new old stock. Since the global chip shortage is driving up everything with an integrated circuit, if you can find it, new old stock is much more economical with a little bit of effort. I found these era-appropriate desktop PC speakers at a cost well below the individual parts. I cut off the amplifier board and the button panel, then drilled some holes and added speaker terminals for a modular speaker connection. I mounted the amplifier assembly in a non-conspicuous but reachable place with metal brackets. And though the included speakers would have worked, I did replace them with some new old stock Sony speakers instead. The Sony speakers have a better frequency response and I suspect better shielding as they appear to be OEM parts for Trinitron televisions. I drilled 3-inch diameter holes under the marquee for the speakers. Installation is a layered sandwich of the speaker, laser cut plate, and a 90mm PC fan grill to keep everything modular, affordable, and easy to mount. And that's it. It's an arcade. I'm working on a few more arcades with some unique features in themselves. They take time, so they'll be ready when they're done. I also plan to do a video on the cabinet design in depth now that I've had some experience building it for different configurations. And I think the burning question here is, where is the Sega Saturn? No disrespect to it, I just had to choose between the Dreamcast and the Saturn, and orange T-molding just looks super sick. So thank you for watching.
Welcome back to the stage of history. Nightmare versus Freak versus Fight.